Net migration hit a record high in 2022 after the Office for National Statistics revised its previous estimate. And it's not a small revision. It now says net migration, which is the number of people coming to the UK minus the number leaving, wasn't 606,000 in 2022, as it previously estimated, but 745,000. That's because last year a lot more people came to the UK and fewer left than they realised. Meanwhile, the ONS net migration estimate for the 12 months to June this year is 672,000. That suggests net migration is coming down slightly, but it's a long way from the Conservatives' 2019 manifesto promise to bring it down from the then level of 212,000. Our senior political correspondent, Paul McNamara, reports.
Hi, I'm from Ghana and I came to UK 8 months ago.
Hi, my name is Dina. I'm from India. I'm being here now 8 months.
Hi, my name is Aisha. I come from Ghana. I've been in the UK since last year, December, so almost a year.
The care sector is a labour-intensive industry, labour that comes from all over the world. 80% of the staff at Hartwood House are international.
They tell me what they do for you, you know. Now they do anything for you.
So desperate is the need for workers in this industry, getting a visa to move here from India is possibly not as hard as you may think.
It was pretty easy because I have got qualification, like, you know, what they needed. So I just applied through the portal and then we got an online interview. And then we processed our visa and then we are here.
So how quick was that process?
All around maybe a month, maybe less than that.
Oh, wow, really quick then.
Yes.
Net migration into the UK last year was a record high, 745,000 people. Where they come from, though, has changed in recent years. The number of migrants from the EU has dropped significantly, while immigration from non-EU countries has been rising sharply since 2021 and now hitting record highs. International students make up the biggest portion of non-EU migrants at 39%. But the main driver of the increase, those here on work visas. They make up 33% of arrivals, up from 22% the previous year. And almost half of those work in the health and social care sector. It's not just push factors, though, making people leave their homes, but the pull of life in the UK.
How much of a draw was salary?
The one I was earning in India, it was more than what I'm earning now. But then always...
You were earning more in India than in the UK?
Yes.
So salary wasn't what drew you over?
No, because there were other things also which we considered, like, you know, lifestyle here, life quality here is very good.
Is this home now?
This is home now, yes.
Forevermore?
Forever and ever.
Wow. Can this industry work or cope without staff from abroad?
No, absolutely not. No, I'm categoric about that. Absolutely, it cannot. It's not about money for local staff. They just don't want to do this sort of work.
There are people who would just say, look, if you paid local staff more, then they'd happily work here.
No, they wouldn't.
Why not?
Because it's not about the money. You can't do this sort of work if you're not the right sort of person. So paying people more actually isn't the answer. If you pay people more, you attract the wrong sort of people. It's people that think, well, I need to earn a little bit more money. I can earn, if I work at Asda, I can earn this, but if I work in care, I can earn a little bit more. But they're not minded for this sort of work.
The new Conservative group of Tory MPs disagree.
So the answer to that is to improve the wages and conditions in the care sector.
They say it's not about wages. There simply aren't the people who actually want to do the work.
If you are suggesting that British people have no appetite for looking after others, that we can only find abroad people who have that compassion and that vocation, I'm afraid I dispute that.
Westminster today, silent. No words on camera by a Prime Minister or Minister on this matter. The Home Secretary released a statement saying the government remained completely committed to reducing levels of legal migration and that the biggest drivers of immigration were testament to our ability to use our immigration system to prioritise the skills we need.
We were elected in 2019 on a manifesto promise to reduce net migration from the level it was at then, which was over 200,000. We've now seen it treble in that time.
So on the whole, you've got it wrong. Your party's got it wrong.
Well, I'm afraid to say that our government has not closed the doors on the huge wave of migration that we've seen over the course of this century.
The Prime Minister's spokesman said migration was putting, quote, unsustainable pressure on communities and councils. Many of his own MPs agree. The trouble is, they say, it's yet another Prime Minister saying yet again the same thing, and still no change. Now, look, the government is on the cusp of announcing new measures, but talking to backbench MPs today who are livid, the point they make is it's too late. We're going into the next election with these numbers. They called it horrific. They said the message we're delivering really to voters is that, quote, the Tories have lost control. Now, normally in situations like this, where you've got numbers like today that you know are going to anger parts of your party, there is some reach out. Spoke to MPs today. Have you heard anything from some of the troublemakers? Have you heard anything from the Prime Minister, from his team? Zilch, zero. They go on to point out that all that proves to show is that the Prime Minister and his team aren't just terrible at delivering policy, they're terrible at basic politics.
Paul McNamara. Well, these are unprecedented numbers. Look back and look specifically down here in the bottom left corner to the 60s and 70s. Then more people left the UK than came to the UK. In the 1990s, net migration really takes off, but the current levels are really like nothing we've seen before. Choices the government has made since Brexit, since, in its words, taking back control, are playing out here. Now, the number of migrants coming from the EU has gone down sharply, but the number of non-EU migrants, look at this, has rocketed. Now, the ONS estimates it may now only just be slowing down a little, that number. In total, 1.2 million immigrants came to the UK last year. And here's the thing, 1 in 5 of them almost were from India, with big numbers too from Nigeria and China. And as you've just seen, this has been driven largely by students and workers coming to plug gaps in our hospitals and in our care homes. Kathy.
Thanks, Kieran. Well, no government minister was available to talk about immigration today, but earlier I went to Westminster to speak to the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, and began by asking her if Labour would cut net migration.
We do think that the net migration figures should come down. I think they reflect the Conservatives' failure over many years on the economy as well as on immigration and on asylum. The figures are 3 times higher than they were at the time of the last election, but they also reflect the big increase in work visas, in migration for work, because they've just not tackled the skills shortages, training problems here at home.
So under a Labour government, would it come down to roughly the level it was at the last election? In a broad, I'm not asking for a target, just a broad sort of direction of travel.
Well, we think the net migration figures should come down, but we also think we actually need the action on tackling this big increase in work visas, 60% or more increase in work migration. That's just in the last 12 months. And that's why we're proposing to get rid of the unfair 20% wage discount. That means that there's an incentive for overseas recruitment, for employers to recruit from overseas rather than to train or to pay people fairly here at home.
If you're raising that minimum salary for work visas, it's going to be more expensive to hire care home workers. It's a shortage occupation, so where are those workers going to come from?
The 20% discount is just unfair. It means people who've come from overseas are being paid 20% less than the going rate because they've been recruited from overseas. That is really bad because in those occupations...
Say they can't get people here to do the job.
That may well be. If they're not paying people fairly, that may be why they can't get people to come and do the job. If they're not paying the going rate...
Yeah, but social care is one of the big sectors, and you're exempting the grassroots employees.
We're not exempting it. It doesn't apply to them at the moment.
So therefore, how much of a dent would you make in the immigration figures? Which brings me back to my first question, which I don't think you quite answered. How much lower would immigration figures be under Labour?
So we think net migration should come down. We're not setting a specific target or a figure.
To what it was at the last election.
Well, we're not setting a specific target and figure, partly because there are always one-off factors. For example, the pandemic obviously pushed numbers down, and the Ukraine visas obviously increased numbers.
Yeah,
so there
but
are
they
always
should come
those
down
factors.
and come down by a lot, like half.
We do think they should come down, and that should reflect, actually there's 3 different areas that it should reflect. It should reflect the work on the action to tackle the work visas requirements. But Secondly, it would reflect the changes as a result of Ukraine and Hong Kong, which we expect to happen anyway. The third area is actually around asylum, because part of the reason the numbers have gone up is because the government is taking so long now to make decisions on asylum cases.
So were you happy with the level immigration was at the last election? Was that broadly in the right ballpark?
So I think, look, we've got to start from where we are now. We believe that net migration should come down. We don't think it's right to set specific targets in place.
Yeah, but I'm just talking broad direction of travel. The last election was roughly where you were roughly happy with that?
Well, again, I think we think the net migration figures should come down, and we're not going to set a specific target. I know you want me to ask.
No,
it will be affected by individual figures.
Yeah.
At that time, of course, the figures around work migration were much lower.
Do you see the number of people wanting to come to this country as a mark of the success of Britain, or is it a failure?
We've got to recognise immigration has been an important part of our country through generations, and will continue to be so, both in terms of our economy and the need for international talent, but also as part of our society. But the system needs to be controlled and managed so that it's fair. And at the moment it's not. There's a lot of chaos in the system. There's no proper links between the immigration system and skills and training requirements or any of those things.
It's a very far cry from the days when your leader, to win the election, promised Labour members that he would defend EU freedom of movement. I just wonder whether you think Labour as a party has got this whole subject wrong, has been out of touch with the public mood for more than a decade.
We've been really clear, we're not going back to free movement, but the question now is how do we get the points-based system to work properly so that you've got something that's fair, so that you've got something that recognises where we have acute skills shortages, but doesn't use immigration as an alternative to tackling those skills shortages here in the UK and getting that investment in training as well.
Yvette Cooper, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now, are we back on the road to austerity? That was the warning today from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Its analysis of yesterday's autumn statement says the Chancellor's tax cuts imply a very tight public spending squeeze in the future. Well, our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is here. How difficult are these numbers looking then, Helia?
Well, Kieran, we know that David Cameron, Lord Cameron, is back, and I think the big question now is whether his flagship policy of austerity with his old Chancellor, George Osborne, is also back. Because if you take a look at the decade before austerity, you can see that public spending actually increased by a monster 40%. But then you had George Osborne's 2010 budget, and £32 billion was slashed from departmental spending. And because health was protected, the hammerhead of austerity fell hardest on courts, prisons, local government. But now let's take a look at Mr Hunt's plans. Because instead of a backdrop of double-digit spending growth, there were cuts of over 7% to non-protected departments. And yes, today's autumn statement comes on top of that, with an extra £20 billion being rolled back. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies says this suggests a package of cuts that match the decade of austerity that we had back in the 2010s.
And Helia, what does the Chancellor say then about these potentially drastic spending cuts?
Well, Kieran, he thinks that those tax cuts are very good for growing the economy. He was very tight-lipped about the spending cuts, but let's take a look at how those two things pan out together. We know the pressure on departments is all because Mr Hunt has chosen not to pass on the inflation rises. And that means in every year of the forecast, you can see that real-term spending cuts. Now, if I show you the tax cuts for each year, you can see that they look almost identical to what's being stripped back from public spending.
And news on our living standards, that's not good either, is it?
No, I'm afraid not, Kieran. The day after budgets is a bit like a mega nerd-crunching event because on top of the IFS analysis, you've also got some number crunching from Resolution Foundation. And for the first time ever, households will be poorer at the end of Parliament than they were at the start, and they'll be poorer by £1,900 a year. Today, we also learned that energy prices will be going up again in January the 1st. And with an election next year, the government is now running out of time if it wants to change this story before the voting begins.